Hello everyone, welcome back to Mind Matters. This season, I want to talk about prejudices, not just from a moral or ethical perspective, but really looking at how they operate in our brains. How do these hidden influencers shape our decisions? I will talk about some lesser-known biases like the IKEA effect, pratfall effect, or the Dunning-Kruger effect. I explore how we think so we can reshape our world from the inside out, because in the end, every mind matters. Why do we feel an instant connection to people who are like us, whether it's rooting for the same sports team, belonging to the same political party, or even wearing the same color shirt? Hey everyone, Ivana here. Welcome to Mind Matters Season 3. Today I'm talking about the question I think we've all asked ourselves at some point. Why do we feel an instant connection to people who are like us? Whether it's rooting for the same sports team, belonging to the same political party, or even wearing the same color shirt. I had my own little us versus them moment just last week. My friend and I were picking sides for a quiz night. Everyone else wanted to join our team because apparently we had an academic vibe. I'm not sure if that was a compliment or an insult, but it was funny how quickly people split into teams. The geeks versus the party animals. Suddenly, each side was trash-talking in a playful way, but you could really sense that in-group pride sparked to life. And that's exactly what we'll talk about today. In fact, a perfect larger-scale example hit the headlines recently. When Argentina faced France in the last World Cup final, entire nations, plus millions around the globe, suddenly found themselves drawing intense lines between us and them. Friends who'd never watched soccer before posted passionate support for Argentina's underdog story or France's bid for a repeat championship. The tension on social media was palpable. You were either all in for Messi or cheering for Mbappé. No middle ground. And that's the power of in-group and out-group dynamics. It turns casual fans into fervent loyalists, dividing entire communities into we and they in a matter of days. So, what exactly are in-groups and out-groups? Think of your in-group as any group you identify with and feel membership in. Family, friends, your favorite sports team, even your chosen fandom online. It's the circle of people or interests that feel like home base. Meanwhile, outgroups are the folks you perceive as existing outside that circle, unfamiliar, different, or sometimes even opposing. In our World Cup example, if you pledged allegiance to Argentina, then France fans became outgroup members and vice versa for the duration of those heated matches. Suddenly, empathy for the other side was in short supply. I will focus on in-group and out-group bias and how these biases form, stretching back to our evolutionary roots. Then explore the science that explains why our brains are hardwired to categorize. Along the way, I will apply it to real-world examples, like how sports rivalries can whip up massive national pride in a flash, or how political echo chambers deepen our divisions. Finally, I'll share practical strategies for bridging these gaps, because while in-group favoritism might be natural, it doesn't have to limit our relationships or our society. Let's jump in. Archaeologists studying ancient human remains in places like Shanidar Cave in modern-day Iraq have found evidence that even our Neanderthal cousins cared for individuals with severe injuries. Think about that. If someone was too injured or ill to gather food, they would only survive if others in the group looked after them. That level of cooperation isn't just luxury, it was a matter of life or death. Genetic research also backs this up, showing that populations with stronger group cohesion were more likely to pass on their genes since they care about their young, therefore cementing a survival advantage. From an evolutionary standpoint, being part of a group offered protection, sharing food, cooperating in the hunt, or simply watching each other's backs in dangerous environments. Over thousands of years, group survival instincts became hardwired in our brains. Today, We might not be hunting mammoths or huddling in caves, but the neural circuits that made tribe loyalty beneficial are still firing away. It's why we can feel such a strong rush of belonging when our sports team scores or our political candidate wins. That sense of us versus them is literally in our DNA. Now let's talk about social cohesion. Evolution didn't just favor any old group. It favored tightly knit ones. Early human communities that worked together had more success securing food, defending territory, and raising children. Over generations, genes tied to cooperation, empathy, and social bonding became more widespread. Modern research in behavioral genetics shows that while our environment shapes a lot of our behavior, certain predispositions for bonding and loyalty are coded into our biology. Last week, I mentioned the amygdala, our brain's automatic threat detector. In breaking news not long ago, you might have seen stories about how European countries responded differently to refugees from Ukraine versus refugees from the Middle East or Africa. Some commentators pointed out that the media and public seemed more welcoming toward Ukrainian families, partly because they were perceived as more familiar. Meanwhile, coverage of other refugees often used phrases like wave or influx, fueling anxiety. That's the amygdala in action. It ramps up when we see unfamiliar or outgroup faces. Importantly, context matters, and these reports did not expand the context. Shared experiences or positive contact with all the refugees can help short-circuit that fear response and replace it with empathy. There is another brain region that can deepen our sense of us versus them, the insula. Neuroendocrinologist Robert Sapolsky, in his book Behave, talks about the insula and its role in feelings of disgust. Historically, the feeling of disgust helped humans avoid spoiled food or disease. But in modern social contexts, it can misfire against people rather than diseases. Insula has been used in historical dehumanization rhetoric many times. Propaganda has often weaponized this disgust response by depicting outgroups as vermin or diseased. For instance, Nazi propaganda infamously portrayed Jewish people as literal rats, stoking revulsion and moral panic. When the insula is triggered in this way, it can lead entire populations to see another group as contaminated and even justify extreme measures like segregation or violence. One can also feel the insula's prejudice toward people living in poor sanitary conditions. One of the most visible modern manifestations of insula-driven disgust is how some react to people experiencing homelessness. Seeing or smelling someone living on the streets may spark a visceral, gut-level repulsion, the same neural circuitry that tells us to recoil from spoiled food. This disgust can quickly morph into dehumanization, with phrases like dirty or infested cropping up, reinforcing an us versus them attitude. Sapolsky points out that this isn't just a harmless reaction, it can fuel policies and social norms that neglect or exclude those deemed unclean. And insula's reaction is used by politics to discriminate against certain lifestyles or identities. The insula's role in moral disgust can also target behaviors or identities that a particular culture deems taboo. In many news stories, we see language describing some sexual orientations or gender identities as unnatural or gross. This emotional revulsion frames the outgroup as morally contaminated, making real dialogue or empathy difficult. Rather than recognizing shared humanity, the knee-jerk insula response drives us to label and shun people who don't fit our personal or cultural norms. Ultimately, recognizing these insula-driven reactions is the first step in managing them. By actively seeking empathy, listening to real stories, and understanding the systemic factors shaping people's lives, we can override the insula's snap judgment. In doing so, we disrupt the reflex that pushes us to see entire groups as disgusting or contaminated, opening a pathway for compassion and genuine human connection. Now I want to cover some key theories through real stories, so it is easier to connect the dots. Social identity theory, Tajfel and Turner, 1979. We define ourselves by our group memberships. A recent example comes from the US midterm elections, where some voters identified so strongly with a particular political party that their party affiliation felt like part of their core self. News outlets interviewed voters who said, "I don't just vote Democrat, I'm a Democrat," or vice versa. This emotional attachment to a group is exactly what Tajfel and Turner were talking about. Feeling like my group's victory is my personal victory can be a powerful motivator. Ever see those online debates where people choose sides over something trivial, like Team Apple versus Team Android? In the news a while back, a viral video showed co-workers teasing each other purely based on who had iPhones and who had Androids. No serious stakes, but they still split into us and them. That's the minimal group paradigm at work. Even flipping a coin or choosing a brand create a rift where people start favoring their own side, even if it's arbitrary. Sikara and colleagues used fMRI in a study to show that when people watch their in-group succeed, say watching your preferred sports team score a goal, the brain's reward centers light up like a pinball machine. We saw a similar phenomenon in last year's Super Bowl coverage. Kansas City Chiefs fans basically celebrated like they'd personally achieved something, while Philadelphia Eagles fans experienced genuine emotional pain at the loss. In fact, there are studies showing a higher rate of heart attacks on the losing side in the following 2 weeks after the game. Our brains treat group outcomes very personally. Finally, Brewer's work focuses on in-group favoritism, which is different from outright hatred of outgroups. Consider the heated tension between certain fandoms, like the so-called Swifties. You don't necessarily see these groups spewing hatred at outsiders all the time, but they strongly champion their own community, sometimes to the point of excluding or dismissing others. It's a subtle but powerful dynamic. We may not hate the outgroup, but we sure do rally around our own in-group. Now I want to talk about synchrony. Have you ever been to a massive concert where for those few hours, you felt like you and thousands of strangers were united in one collective heartbeat? Whether it's chanting lyrics in unison or swaying in the same rhythm, that shared synchronization can be electrifying. And it has a real, measurable impact on how we see each other. What is it? Singing, moving, or chanting together. Think of sports chants, group exercise classes, or a concert crowd jumping in sync. Naturally boosts trust and camaraderie. We are hardwired for bonding. Neuroscientists studying group movements found that synchronized actions release endorphins and even increase pain tolerance. Essentially, our brains reward us for these in-step activities, reinforcing a sense of closeness. This is the thrill of in-group. The magic of moving in unison can also create an in-group on the spot, prompting us to see those who join our collective dance or chant as instantly more likable, sometimes at the expense of anyone not sharing in that moment. And have you ever heard of the collective effervescence effect? Coined by sociologist Emile Durkheim, this term captures the intense excitement and unity people feel during shared rituals or events. Concerts are a prime example. When the music swells and the crowd roars together, it feels like you're part of something bigger than yourself. In that concert atmosphere, where everyone is belting out the same chorus, there's an extraordinary sense of togetherness. You may find yourself striking up conversations with total strangers as if they're old friends. Unintended consequence, the flip side, is that while you're bonding with your new concert family, you might also deepen a divide with people who aren't part of that energy. This can create a subtle us versus them stance, where those outside the experience seem distant, indifferent, or even adversarial. Concert rivalries, festivals sometimes pit fans of different headlining acts against each other. That group pride can cement alliances but also exclude outsiders. This principle extends beyond concerts. Think about political rallies or religious gatherings. The thrill of chanting in unison can boost solidarity within a group, yet also sharpen lines against anyone not participating. Now that we've laid out the basics of how we form in-groups and out-groups, plus the brain mechanics behind it all, it's time to get real about how this plays out around us. You might be thinking, sure, it's human nature to pick sides, but how big a deal is it really? Well, let's talk through some real-world examples, especially from right here in Europe, that show just how pervasive these dynamics can be. Social polarization. Let's start with political divides. A few years ago, I think just about everyone in the UK and beyond felt the shockwaves of Brexit. Whether you were in favor of leaving or remaining in the European Union, you couldn't deny how polarized people got. Friends, families, co-workers, everyone formed their own us versus them groups. If you hopped on social media, you saw whole communities dedicated to one view or the other, sharing memes, articles, and opinions that basically shut out anyone who disagreed. It's what some experts call echo chambers. Once you're in one, all you hear is your own group's side. Over time, shared consensus grows stronger, and before you know it, outgroups are demonized. You might hear terms like traitors or isolationists, depending on which side you're on. And that's not just a UK phenomenon. You can see similar patterns in debates over European unity in countries like Italy or Poland. Once polarization sets in, it's tough to have nuanced conversations. Let's shift gears to something a bit more fun, but still super relevant. If you've ever been to a major European football match, say Real Madrid versus FC Barcelona in Spain or Celtic versus Rangers in Scotland, you know just how tribal it can feel. Standing in a stadium among tens of thousands of fans, chanting in unison for your team is the ultimate in-group rush. On one hand, that unity can be an amazing bonding experience. On the other, it can lead to hostility toward the opposing side, sometimes even erupting into violence or deeply rooted contempt. Another area where us versus them sneaks up on us is cultural conflicts. Different EU countries have their own traditions, like wearing religious symbols in schools or how certain holidays are celebrated, and these sometimes clash with newer or minority cultural practices. People in the majority group might feel their way of life is under threat, while minority groups feel ostracized or misunderstood. Even something as basic as how you greet someone or celebrate a holiday can create friction if each side frames the other as not like us. Finally, let's circle back to social media, the ultimate amplifier of group biases. Platforms like Twitter, or X known as it's now known, Instagram and Facebook, run on algorithms that serve us the content we're most likely to engage with. If I'm already leaning toward, for instance, an anti-immigration stance, I might see more posts or pages that reinforce that viewpoint. Suddenly, my feed becomes an echo chamber where my in-group is right and anyone disagreeing is ignorant or dangerous. It's this constant feedback loop that drives group polarization to new heights. When every post in your timeline says a certain outgroup is terrible, you begin to see them that way, often without question. And then, ironically, the other side is doing the exact same thing in their own echo chamber. A French study showed that political content on Facebook often sticks to user bubbles, meaning you're far more likely to see posts that confirm your biases than challenge them. Multiply that across an entire society, and you can see why bridging the gap feels so daunting. The bottom line is that these dynamics aren't happening in some distant realm. They're literally around us every day, in our offices, our news feeds, and our laws. But recognizing these patterns is half the battle. When we become aware of how echo chambers form or how implicit bias operates, we can start taking real steps. whether individually or at a policy level, to bridge those divides. All right, everyone, we've spent a lot of time talking about how our brains are wired for us versus them and all the ways that can create real-world friction. But it's not all doom and gloom. This segment is all about practical strategies, concrete things we can do right now to bridge divides and reduce bias in everyday life. I'm going to walk you through a few steps that I like to call our bias-busting toolkit. Ready? Let's jump in. Step 1. Empathy-building exercises. Perspective taking. Imagine you're having a disagreement with someone from a completely different background. Maybe it's a coworker who grew up in another country, or a neighbor with polar opposite political views. Now pause and ask, what would life look like if I woke up in their shoes every day? This little mental exercise nudges you to see the world through their lens. It might sound simple, but research shows perspective taking can lower stress levels in conflict situations and even reduce implicit bias. Active listening. Instead of rushing to prove your point, try rephrasing what the other person just said. You might say, so what I'm hearing is that you're frustrated with X because of Y? Did I get that right? When we slow down and confirm we've truly heard each other, defensiveness drops. The conversation becomes about understanding rather than winning. Practice with a friend or partner. They pick a short, rant-worthy topic, favorite pizza topping perhaps, and you have to restate their points before replying. It can be surprisingly entertaining and enlightening. Step 2. Cognitive tools. The idea here is that positive, meaningful interactions with out-group members can reduce prejudice. It's not enough to just be in the same room. The interaction has to be constructive. Think about a cooking club, a cultural festival, or a volunteer team where diverse people work side by side. When you collaborate toward a shared goal, say preparing a meal or cleaning up a local park, it breaks down stereotypes naturally. Catch yourself in a mental shortcut. Maybe you notice a thought like, he looks too young to be qualified, or she's probably not interested in sports. Ask yourself, is that a stereotype at play? Everyone has different interests, so why not just ask about her favorite sport? Or age doesn't determine skill. Let's see what he can do. Step 3, synchrony for good. We learned that group activities like chanting in unison can forge intense bonds and sometimes exclude others. Let's flip that on its head. Use group bonding intentionally. In your next team building session, mix groups so people who don't normally interact have to collaborate. Whether it's a goofy trust fall exercise or a group drumming session, that shared rhythm can bring together folks from different departments or backgrounds. Consider adding a musical moment everyone can participate in, like a simple clap and stomp routine. Research shows synchrony leads to immediate boosts in trust and cooperation. So there you have it, a handful of practical, actionable steps to tackle in-group and out-group biases from multiple angles. The main point is to start somewhere. That's a wrap for this episode of Mind Matters. I'm Ivana, and I hope today's deep dive into in-group and out-group biases has you thinking about the subtle ways we categorize the world around us. Remember, we're not stuck in our tribal mindsets. Awareness is the first step toward creating more inclusive communities. In the meantime, try one of our empathy-building exercises with a friend or coworker, and let me know how it goes. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you found this episode helpful or insightful, please share it with someone who might enjoy it too. Until next time, keep your mind open, and remember, we're all in this together, whether we realize it or not. I will link all the studies and references in the show's description. If you found this discussion insightful, please consider sharing it with friends, family, or colleagues. Let's keep the conversation going about how we can make this affluent corner of Europe a healthier, more equitable place for everyone. Until next time, remember, your mind matters, and taking care of it is the best investment you'll ever make.